So this is my pedagogical philosophy video. Essentially how this is going to work is I'm going to show a cue card. Cue card is one of the 12 titles. For each of them I'll have 1 to 2 readings. They'll either have impact my pedagogical philosophy in a positive way, being that I want to pick something up from it, or a negative way in that I saw something I didn't like in the reading and I want to go the other way. So the first one is the role of the teacher. For this one, I picked 2 readings. I picked the Collins 2011 and the Broderick and Leonardo 2016 readings. Both of them talked about essentially positioning of students, in that with the Collins article, it was more positioning the student is they are there to learn, and it's not really a community of learners, which is something I'll talk about later. But essentially, I want my classroom to be something where it's not I'm just the instructor and I put the knowledge onto them, but in an environment in where the students and I are learning as a team. And with the Broderick and Leonardo article, it talked about goodness, and I do not believe that it is up to the teacher to position goodness. In fact, when you position good, you also position bad, and that is just not something I want to see within my classroom. The next article is the role of the student. For this one, I chose the Rogoff Community of Learners, and within this, like I just said, I want it to be a learning experience. On page 213, they write, children and adults are active in structuring and shared endeavors, with adults responsible for the overall guiding of the process, and children learning to participate in management of their own learning and involvement. So I want to be there to guide, but not to direct, essentially. And the next session is relationship with the family. This was a section where I learned what I do not want to do, and I learned this through the Harry and Klinger 2006 article, which was just the one that was chapter 5. It was the construction of family identity, and the story that stuck out the most to me was Robert's mother, Jacynthia, in which the author writes, This mother was often described in very derogatory terms by some school personnel. While some acknowledged that she was polite and well-spoken, others focused on their knowledge that she had a history of drug addiction, or the fact that she had 9 children in all by more than one union. I believe that I need to have a positive relationship with the parents, something that the Where article talked about, with one demander being another mother. Well, in my case, it would be being another father. So working with the parent for the student's benefit. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the impact of context, and I'm looking at this as the classroom impact on behavior. The article that I chose to focus on with this one was the Weinstein et al. 2003 article. This one talks about different ways to organize the physical arrangement and establishing expectations for behavior. For my pedagogical philosophy, something that stood out in this article was on page 271, when it talks about organizing the physical environment, and it talks about desks arranged in clusters, for example, allow students to work together on activities, share material, and have small group discussions, and help each other on assignments. It's been in my experience that I do not want to use rows and columns. I'd rather use clusters or big circle, especially being that I'm a literature and American literature teacher. I want it so that my students can have a way of creating relationships without feeling estranged from each other. And I feel that having rows and columns and having the classroom reflect an individual statement, kind of like neoliberalism, just would not be effective for that at all. The next up was function of the curriculum. We didn't really touch on this at all or very much in this class, but in another class of mine, we touched on different ways that English teachers can impact their students via curriculum, and one of them was in a Hallman 2009 article, which is Novel Roles for Books. Essentially, this talked about using young adult literature in the classroom, and it oftentimes allows students of minorities to see themselves represented in literature that they otherwise wouldn't. This does a lot for the students in that it gives themselves, they can see themselves in it. The next section I want to touch on is beliefs in failure, success, and neutrality. For this one, I'm looking at the Noguera and Wing article, in which they talk about closing the achievement gap at Berkeley, and something that I wanted to challenge the idea of failure and kind of the social construction of what the normalization of failure is. To move away from that, they give 3 bullet points on pages 21, 22, and 23 that touch on to make the familiar seem strange and problematic, to critically examine and organize the structure of privilege, and to empower and disadvantage the marginalized. These are 3 things that I want to focus on, especially within my classroom, and using things like young adult literature within my curriculum will allow me to do so. The social construction of disability. For this one, I am turning to the Connor 2008 article, which looks at the story of Michael, but also I want to kind of go past that and use the term culturally responsive pedagogy, which was something Ladson Billings 1994 touched on. But in this, he talks about how oftentimes he felt labeled as a learning deficient student, and that label oftentimes wasn't correct. I want to make sure that I'm not labeling students learning deficient because I see a problem behavior in them. Sorry. And that if I see a problem behavior, I want to do something practical, like Dr. Anima talks about marking it down on a piece of paper to see if they're actually acting out as much as I think they are, or if it's a real issue. So moving forward from there, I want to talk on the pipeline routes for specific students. We talked about a couple of different groups, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to touch briefly on one, the LGBT youth of color, which is the Hemingway et al. 2014 article. And it talks about the 3 different ways that they are kind of pushed out of schools or pushed into the pipeline. They're over-policed and feel like they're being watched or surveyed a lot more than other students. They're receiving harsher punishments for the same whatever behavior it could be, and they are being blamed for their own punishment. They're being victimized themselves, and this eventually will lead to push out. And being consciously aware and creating, looking at the actions that I'm doing and thinking about the punishments, although I'm planning on not using the term punishments really within my classroom, and being cognizant of that, I can help prevent LGBT youth of color from hopefully not ending up in the pipeline. The next I wanted to talk about was the types of discipline that you engage in. For this one, I'm looking at the Payne et al. Article, and also kind of going back to the Collins et al. Article, the Collins 2011 article. The Collins article really talked about forcing a student out that was making him a bad boy, that was essentially putting the kid away from the rest of the class, which really didn't work in my mind. I wouldn't want to push this student out of my classroom. I would go up to him and say, if you need to take 5 to 6 minutes, walk around outside in the classroom, just recalm yourself. That's what I'd rather do instead of having to push that student out. And on the Payne et al., it talks about using different types of power. It talks about using 2 powers in my mind that I really don't want to use within my classroom. The normative power, which is holding a higher position in cultural society, or the coercive power, forcing obedience after threatening a punishment. These 2 are really things that I don't want to use within my classroom. I don't plan on using them. I would much rather use the last type of power that they refer to. They use it as charm, using one's personality, and that would come through things like creating trust between my students and I, and having my students get to know me as a person, which moves into pedagogical models. For this one, I'm looking at 2 different types of models. I'm looking at the Duncan Andrade 2009 article and the Ware article 2006. Duncan Andrade looking at the 2 different types of hope that I would want to use within my classroom, the material and the Socratic hope. material, being that I, as a low-income student, oftentimes didn't have lunch money going into classes, and so I wanted that to be able to give that to my students. And with the Socratic Hope being in a English classroom, I want my students to be able to talk and know about each other, and create a good classroom where everybody feels they can speak their mind. With the Where article, I see myself as being a warm demander, as a caregiver, but also I talked earlier about being the other father, and that being something that I believe very strongly in, and also belief about my students, so that my students know that I believe in them and that I want to set high standards for them, and I want to also give them high support. The relationship with students, I want to build trust. That really is talked about in the Gregory Ripsky 2008 article. Creating trust between students causes the students to be less likely to act out. That's something that they touched on page 345. So essentially, if my students trust me more, I will feel more comfortable, and I will also see them act out less. And the very last one, I'm going to get through this really brief. I don't have this article with me, but it's the Advancement Project 2014. And on page 3, it talks about the using restorative justice so that the victim and the wrongdoer are allowed a chance to sit and reflect. This is the type of discipline that I would want to use. This allows both people to see what happened wrong and both people to reflect on it and move past it. And that is my pedagogical philosophy.